The Pedder Unplugged podcast is recorded in Nipaluna, Hobart, Lutruwita, Tasmania, land of the Palawa people. We pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening. Welcome to another brand new episode of Pedder Unplugged, recently featured in the Tas Weekender magazine. So huge thank you to everybody who listens and shares the podcast. It's a really great way to help not only the podcast, but also the Restore Pedder campaign. Send a podcast link to a friend and encourage them to listen. Today's episode is extraordinary with the one and only Bob Graham. Bob is behind innumerable environmental campaigns in Tasmania. He's been active with the Wilderness Society from day one, and along with his late wife, the wonderful Helen Gee, the two were responsible for the Douglas Apsley National Park on Tasmania's east coast. Bob's a prolific bushwalker. Today he spends much of his time up in the Central Highlands and the Lakes area, but before that he spent much time in the very remote southwest, and he shares that story and the influence of Lake Pedder with us today. I'm your host, Tabitha Badger, and I'm really excited to be bringing you this story. So please enjoy listening to Bob Graham.
I'm very fortunate in that from the age of 13, I became a serious bushwalker when kids were doing other things. I was never interested in competition, competitive sport, or anyway, it just appealed to me, and that's what I got involved in. And during my teenage years also, I travelled to all mainland states of Australia, some of it bushwalking, some of it just taking the country in, always getting stories and info back on southwest Tasmania from friends who had been. I deliberately saved it up till later in life when I was 20 because I wanted a whole summer season, 3 months non-stop, to check out the southwest. And my first trip was, at the age of 20, went into Federation Peak and got snowed on 4 times and got cold and wet and did a lot of learning. Went to Pedder and had quite a few days there, and it was just such a different experience to have lots of open space instead of, well, mountains are open space, but not being encumbered by thick scrub and difficulty finding campsites. There's plenty of open beach. And the big thing, and now this I think is what influenced many people who visited Pedder, and they became activists because of the orientation. Now we know the beach, and I'm going into old measurements now, 2 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide. It's absolutely enormous. There's lakes all over Tasmania, but there's nothing like Pedder. And there's huge beach, and you're facing west. Now, to your southwest is the Franklin and Wilmot ranges, and they're incredibly jagged and fascinating to look at. You've got the weather, which predominantly comes from the west. So you've got cloud formations over these mountains, and you've got the west is where the sun sets. So every night is potentially spectacular. Of course, it can be raining or misty, but every night's different. And with the lake and beach as a foreground and just the whole atmosphere of being in a remote place, it's just inspirational night after night after night. And I think that is why many people were inspired to become activists for such a fascinating and beautiful place. So I spent some days there, and over the next couple of years, I went back to Pedder probably 6 or 10 times. Approached it from most angles, walked in from over the Coronets and from Scotts Peak several times, traversed the Wilmots and Franklins and came down to it, flew in and out of it. Got to know it and love it, and being very well aware that its days were numbered. And then, of course, we became familiar with the politics behind it all, how the hydro, HEC, was running the state. They were telling the politicians what to do instead of the politicians telling them what to do. I'm not exaggerating.
So when you first went to Lake Pedder, had it already been decided that it would be flooded then?
Yes. Yeah. the construction was underway. The road was in 1970 to Scotts Peak, and construction was underway, and it was considered by some to be a fait accompli. And the whole politics of Tasmania was sort of centred on the hydro. They were the God-given right to do as they wished. Now, I know the actual scheme, there are 3 dams that flood Lake Pedder. So they dam the water going down the Serpentine River to the west and the Huon River sort of to the east. And there's 2 dams to stop the Huon. And then it goes over a divide. I've never known of a dam anywhere else that you actually flood up and over a divide. It just seems a crazy way to do it. And only the top 5 feet of that water can ever be used, and because it flows under gravity across McPartland's Pass to the Gordon storage. If those dams fail, firstly, the environmental consequences for the whole Huon River Valley would be catastrophic, and it would be socially devastating, to say the least. Loss of life and property could be huge. In hindsight, well, at any site, it was crazy to build the dams on a fault. To spend money now on the Edgar and Scotts Peak dams is just folly. And I'm sure new technology is coming, and it might well be suburban and by suburb and village by village and town by town that we generate and consume our own power on site and don't need to transmit it all over the countryside and generate it in big schemes in one place or another.
Yeah, absolutely. Adaptivity, add some resilience into the grid. It all makes far more sense in the contemporary times in which we live.
It just seemed an incongruous thing. I don't know how. Anyway, they did dream it up. And we felt that there was always hope. And I personally got progressively involved in the campaign, but it wasn't instantaneous. And I think it built in myself and in society as the deadline approached. So 72 was the time, 1972, and the water was just getting further and further up there.
Do you think it was a generalised feel across the community that a place so beautiful and unique as Lake Pedder simply couldn't be flooded, and the government would realise that and pull the pin on the whole project?
Well, the government wasn't going to change their mind. Society was. And, well, I used to stand on street corners and gather petitions, and you'd get talking to people and explaining things to them. Interest and support was building over time. And ultimately we got the federal government to offer the money to change the scheme, and the Tasmanian government just laughed it off. They weren't remotely interested in not flooding Lake Pedder.
So were you mostly involved as a part of the, I guess, Save Lake Pedder campaign? Did you get involved in the United Tasmania group?
So we had an election in 72, from memory, state election. I can tell you why this happened. We'd had a long succession of Labor governments in Tasmania. Then in 1969, the Liberals gained power with a majority of 1, and that was a coalition with 1 member from the Centre Party, which had some conservation allegiances. Kevin Lyons, a son of former Prime Minister, was the member involved. Anyway, that government finished in 1972, but Labor and Liberal both had equal support for flooding Pedder. But because there was a state election, we threw our hat in the ring and contested the election, of course. And we formed the world's first environmental political party in doing so. And we tried everything we could. We had one very interesting candidate, Sir Alfred White, who had been a member of the Labor government. He had been Attorney General for Tasmania in London. He was getting on in years, but he almost got in because he was well known. And if we'd got the balance of power and we'd got him in, things might have been very different, but they weren't. Labor got back in, and there was no way Liberals were going to disagree with them on flooding Pedder. So, you can only keep battling on. And, I was just mostly a helper, collecting signatures, on petitions and talking to people and influencing them. One job I remember, we had this huge model. It was about 9 feet wide. I know 9 feet because a trailer on the road is only 8 feet. And we had to get permits and things to carry this thing around the countryside. And I don't know how long. And it needed a great four-wheel drive to tow it. And I would take it to country shows and display it. And it was of Pedder and the mountains around it.
And do you remember having walked on the Franklin and Wilmot Range, getting more of a view of the Serpentine Valley and the Serpentine River? And it's often something we forget about when we talk about Lake Pedder, but that's quite iconic and significant as well.
I don't know if it was that trip walking along the range, looking down on it, which is parallel to the Serpentine Valley. And I'm thinking, Pedder is beautiful and it's meaningful to me, but that Serpentine Valley is just as important ecologically, and I will be fighting for that equally over Pedder. And therefore, I'm not supporting an alternative scheme that floods half the valley and not the other half of the valley. And I guess that was the genesis of the evolution of my attitude and actions right through my now 50 years as a campaigner. Don't compromise. To compromise is to lose. So if you agree, you can flood this half of the valley, but not that half of the valley, you've lost half your valley, just like a forest. If you bargain off one for another, you've lost something. So that's been my rule ever since then, because, I don't want to lose anything.
Do you remember ever being involved in any, I guess, campfire conversations around at Lake Pedder, around the beach, right near the nail end before it was flooded, and the general sense of how people felt about it? Because it got quite crowded at the end, didn't it, with lots of people going to see it before it was flooded?
I can't remember individual conversations because it's more than 50 years ago now. And I've had a few campfire conversations since then, and some of them have been very pleasant. I do very much remember my last trip to Pedder, and it was in June 72. And now the vigil camp was in operation. A very dedicated young fellow called Chris Tebbett manned that sort of solo for some time. Anyway, Brenda Heen's tent was still up. I think I slept in it. It was quite a big, spacious tent. When she already died, or was it about,
a couple of months later?
I can't quite remember, but I was certainly in and using her tent, whether I slept in it or ate in it, I can't remember, in the dunes there behind the beach. And it was quite a sad feeling to walk away as the water was rising. It had risen. The beach was covered, and to walk, and so couldn't walk back out to Scotts Peak. It had to walk out the Swampy Creek Coronets track, and to get there, you had to cross Maria Creek, and it was incredibly cold and it was waist deep, and it takes a long, long time. You can't just cross. You've got to wade out an angle into the lake to get to the shallowest part. If you try and walk a straight line, it's much deeper. So, I well remember how cold it was in June, crossing Maria Creek that last time. It's deep in my mind. But, it was a sad time to think, well, I don't expect to see this place again. And I not only never went back, but it was at least 30 years later that I went back to 50 feet above it on the lake, on a boat, but I just stayed away from there for decades because, it was emotionally distressing.
Yeah. So did that dissuade you from, I guess, bushwalking some of the places in the southwest, for example, the Mount Anne area, where the Pedder impoundment is really intrusive to the views?
I've been back to Mount Anne many, many times since the inundation, and it's distressing to look and see it all flooded, but it was at least 30 years before I went back to the Franklin Range, which is right there. No, I just went to other places.
Yeah. Probably walked more of the whole of Tasmania than most people.
Oh, I don't know.
Is there anywhere else at all that could come close to comparing to the feeling that you get at Lake Pedder? Obviously, geographically, it's very different.
There's no lakes like Pedder anywhere in Tasmania. We've got some big lakes in the Central Plateau. I'm excluding all inundated, man-made lakes. Natural lakes, there are some beautiful ones, and I'm very fond of them, but nothing quite like Pedder. It was just so expansive, and as I say, faced these wonderful sunsets, and you had the dunes and shelter and campsites, and it had lots of attributes. I remember, I think it was Easter 72. I think that, I'm not sure, there was 1,000 people on the beach one particular day. And when you think, a few of them might have flown in, but most of them walked in. It was just building as a political and social issue. And if we'd had a few more years to campaign, things might have been different. But yeah, you need a campaign and you need the politics.
Yes.
Which brings me to another little story that we proved in the courts that Pedder was being flooded illegally. So it had been a national park, and they didn't care about that. They just, I'm not sure if the park was revoked by then or not, and I can't remember the fine detail, but there was a court case and it was proven that the flooding was illegal. And the Attorney General was Merv Everett, and he had been I think a QC, certainly a serious lawyer. And he resigned. And I thought, this is amazing. The head lawyer in the state finally is an honourable man. He's resigned. But I know. Premier Eric Rees, who's a miner from the West Coast and knew almost nothing about the law, steps in as Attorney General and passed the doubts removal bill to justify the flooding. And then Everett steps back in as Attorney General. So the whole thing was a cynical ploy. And that just destroys one's faith in politics and government.
Yeah.
Certainly for me.
Well, actually, we've got Greg French's book here, The Wild Heart, and it's the living history of Lake Malbina in the Western Lakes. And in it, he talks about a few of the other lakes through the Central Highlands that were flooded around the same time as Pedder, and how they certainly didn't receive, retrospectively, the same recognition as Lake Pedder did. Do you think in the community, were they just completely unknown because they were less scenic and less unique in the geomorphology sense? Or was that area of the Central Highlands had already been heavily modified by hydro with numerous other schemes that it was sort of taken for granted that progress, in inverted commas, was taking place there?
So the Great Lake was, I think, increased 3 times. The first time the water went south and down through the Watamana scheme, and the final one, it goes north and goes down through Poatina. So that has happened progressively over many decades, and it was sort of, some inundation and exploitation had already happened. And I don't know when Lake Augusta was dammed and diverted into Great Lake. But there are, and then you've got, of course, the Mersey Fourth scheme, which just drains the Central Highlands. And I can't tell you which year that was commissioned, but yeah, schema, the hydro plan to dam every significant river in Tasmania. They're all there. That's what they were for. I well know the Davey River was on their chart. I've been down there and rubber boated down parts of it, and been to their hydro huts, seen their maps on the walls, and seen their tracks for their gauging station investigations. And they wanted every river of any that they could and would, just progressively. So when Pedder was lost, we knew that the next one was the Pieman. And I had canoed the Pieman from one end to the other, and so knew it personally. Yeah. And it was there was virtually no campaign to stop it, because we were all exhausted and worn out and disillusioned after Pedder, and we sort of dug our heels in for the next one that we thought we could combat, and we called it the Lower Gordon. Well, that was called the Lower Gordon scheme. It wasn't then decided how much the Franklin would be impacted, where the dams would be, because there were several options, whether how many on the Franklin, how many on the Gordon. And we didn't call it the Franklin campaign. We certainly knew about the river, but we called it the Lower Gordon, and we had meetings and discussions and plans. But yeah, the rest of the 1970s sort of slipped by. We were hammering about saving forests and mining. All these things were going on at once, and we just sort of let the Pieman be damned, sadly, and it was. And then, Hendy Anthony scheme and King, and yeah, they all just, before you could blink, there's another scheme being planned. And yeah, we know what happened with the Franklin. They certainly would have damned it if they could have.
Yeah, yeah. Did you play much of a role in the Franklin campaign?
Leading question. I had 6 years campaigning in the 70s, and some of them were very frustrating times. I initially was a helper, and then I built myself up to be much more of an active campaigner, and I don't claim to have ever been particularly good at it. I used the traditional methods of lobbying politicians, holding public meetings, raising funds, putting out press releases, running community events, and yeah, I never liked any of it really. Some people, a few, enjoyed all that stuff. Some were much better at it than me, but by about 77 or 8, I just had enough and just couldn't wait to get out of town and do something else in my life. Yeah. So in 78, my wife and I bought our grazing property near the East Coast and moved there and drifted into establishing a farm business and then raising a family. And yeah, I had very young children at the time of the Franklin.
Well, you mightn't have been directly involved, but you did play a big part in setting up the Wilderness Society, which was absolutely fundamental in saving Franklin.
So, yes, once again, we were disillusioned by the losses of Pedder, and we were really busy with trying to save southwest Tasmania and stop mining and forestry. It was difficult. The media didn't want to know us. Politicians wouldn't openly laugh, but they would be in there face to face across the table lobbying, and they'd just change the subject or appear disinterested, or it was really, really frustrating. We had several organisations, and sometimes my very good friend Kevin Keenan would just start another organisation. When there was, like, when the Army were going to have a firing range at South Cape, we just started a South Cape Action Committee. I mean, we just started up a new organisation and hit it hard. Anyway, we weren't doing too well at saving southwest Tasmania, in our opinion. But we would have statewide meetings maybe every 6 months or maybe 3 months. But a great place to have them was Bob Brown's at Liffey, because it was friendly to the whole state. People could come from the northwest, come from Launceston, come from the south. And yeah, it was very there and friendly, and Bob was very supportive. And so at one of those meetings, there were 16 people from, and there's at least 1 or 2 from the mainland and from different parts of Tasmania. And Kevin, he hadn't lobbied, he hadn't said anything before. He just said he proposed we start a new organisation called the Tasmanian Wilderness Society. And he outlined, a bigger picture from the way we were at the moment. And without any planning or second thoughts, I was the next person to speak. And I just said how this was a great idea and I'm all for it. And I've forgotten who else spoke. But we then went on to form the organisation. And yes, that's history. There were 16 of us at the meeting, but there was only a handful, I'm meaning 5 or 6 people who did the work. And it was considerable and it built. And we aimed big. We instantly included a Western Tasmania World Heritage campaign in our evolution. We included Antarctica and the whales and anything we could think of. I mean, and we'd already had several southwest Tasmania action committees in mainland centres. And I think the Sydney one was a bit reluctant to call himself Wilderness Society for a while. They still wanted to be an action committee. But anyway, progressively, we got more states involved. And I can remember doing our national mail out from my living room floor, because that's where it was. Yeah, we just built it as we went on. And it worked. So we'd done other things that hadn't worked, and that did. But it took a couple of years or so for it to really mushroom.
Yeah. And as you say, a lot of hard work from those that...
Yes, so we started off with one desk. The Environment Centre in Bathurst Street in the middle of Hobart was rented premises, up a level above a shop, and it was sort of open going good for any environmental organisation. So that's where we ran UTG from. And so we just took a desk in the corner, and we were all volunteers. Someone said, they couldn't put any more time in, they needed employment of some sort. I found $50 a week. Also, I proposed that we don't accept any government money, because I had seen in other organisations that we'd get government funding and then we'd be a bit shy about criticising and heaving it on the government. So I said, no matter how hard it is, we should not accept government funding because it stifles initiative. And for some time we didn't, and now we don't either. But I think there were different personalities and different times, and government funding was accepted at times. But yeah, we did it the hard way. Anyway, I found $50 a week for the first paid organiser to work from one desk in the Wilderness Society. But otherwise, we're all volunteers. If I wasn't in the bush or doing something else, I was in there, not all day, but on a daily basis.
Yeah. You know, obviously, Helen played a huge role in the Pedder 2000 campaign. Did you have anything to do with that, or was restoring Pedder ever on the Wilderness Society's agenda from back when it started?
When we started the Wilderness Society in 76, Helen immediately delineated her role as producing the Southwest book. She wanted to concentrate on the all its information and getting it out there to enlighten people as what was going on and how great the Southwest was. So yeah, she was there at meetings and part of us, but her efforts were largely, and took 3 years to collect the information from a great number of people and edit it, and then go back to all these authors and make everybody happy and organise it and make it happen. So that was a 3-year works progress for her. Yeah, near the end of that, we bought our farm and moved out of Hobart and had less hands-on involvement in the Wilderness Society or active conservation, but still, we formed the East Coast branch of the Wilderness Society and ultimately took on Wielangta and the Douglas Apsley. That's a sort of separate, but yeah, we're still active. And in those campaigns, I was much more comfortable. I don't know if you want to digress at all, but the Douglas Apsley was my idea, and I had lots of help. But I saw my role as putting a track through, publicising it, taking people for walks, having functions, not sitting in an office and working telephones and pieces of paper. So, and I was much better at that role than I was in the former.
I always wondered, did you come up with calling the track the Lea Barra track, or is that implemented later?
No, it came after we got the national park in 89. There was a ministerial advisory committee formed, and I was the Wilderness Society delegate to that. And our first ranger was Cheryl Nagel, and she came up with that idea of, she said, what should we name the track? And I thought, I don't know. She said, well, how about this? And I said, I don't have any objection. So that's how it came.
Yeah. Are there any, I don't know, other memories of Lake Pedder or any other moments that stood out for you, especially that you look back on fondly? Or
it was on that same first visit when I was there for some days or a week, a tiny aeroplane flew in, and it was Bob Mossel from South Australia, who's produced several photographic books, many of them aerial photos all around Australia, and he just loved flying so much that he took me and my friend for a joyride, if you like, for the cost of the fuel, which was even then wasn't much. And we flew down to Port Davey and landed and had lunch with Denny King and his family and flew back. Yeah, it was pretty inspirational to be able to get up there and get a bird's eye view of it all. And I just remembered, just prior to that, a plane flew in. We see these tourists get out of this aeroplane, and he walks up and says his name and puts out his hand for a handshake and explains who he was. And the answer was, Denny King, Port Davey. It was Denny's first visit back to Lake Pedder since 1939. And he brought his daughters, Janet and Mary, who became very good, close friends of mine. And yeah, it was wonderful to meet Denny, and then for the first time on the Lake Pedder beach. And all a bit matter of fact for him, but yeah, he was back in 1939 and his first visit there when he'd walked there from Port Davey. And I heard secondhand from somebody else that he washed the gravel and he carried a shovel wherever he went. He washed the gravel in his shovel at every creek just in case there was some gold or tin in it. Yeah, I got to know Denny very, very well and spent a winter with him at Port Davey 1 year and had countless trips in and out of Melaleuca, including several on his yacht tour from Hobart. Yeah. I say there's nothing quite like Pedder. It's in a rugged, like southwest is full of jagged pointy mountains and mud and button grass plains and thick scrub. And here you've got this incredible open space. And if you've ploughed through mud and pushed through scrub or cross mountain ranges to get there, you just appreciate this incredible open vista. You can run and walk and swim and do things you can't in other places. Yeah, there's nothing quite like Pedder.
Huge thank you to Bob for being so generous with his time, squeezing in this interview between various meetings for the Wilderness Society and other activist campaigns. There are links in the show notes to the various things that we discussed, including Greg French's new book. If you'd like to learn more about the Restore Pedder campaign, you can visit lakepedder.org. I'm Tabitha Badger, and thanks for listening.